I think we're in a slightly doldrum situation. I think the theatre has been too influenced by kind of television type casting, television type, attitudes. Carol, we're doing an interview here, darling, which you told me about downstairs. No, sorry, that's the stage manager. She's the company manager. I think a company has to have the vision of a director or a collective group like the Royal Exchange have or the Glasgow Citizens have. I've been working in Moscow and it's very interesting what's happening there. There are all these young actors and young directors who don't want to work in the Moscow Arts Theatre. And the interesting thing about a socialist state is they can afford not to, because they can go off and start new theatre ventures, which is the advantage of socialism, if you like.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, you're running, are you?
Yeah.
Fine. Was Titus the first time you'd worked with Deborah?
Oh yes, I mean I didn't even know who Deborah was. I'd heard about her, and I had to say that when I was asked by Terry Hands if I was go, I remember reading a few notices of. Sorry, should we start? People walking about. Jill, can you ask? It's difficult.
Question again.
Go ahead.
So this was the first time you'd worked with Deborah Warner?
Yeah, it was the first time. I didn't know her. I mean, I knew of her. I read some things that Michael Radcliffe had written about her. And I actually couldn't remember her name. I remember there was this extraordinary girl, and I remember talking to Terry Hands about when he asked me about doing Titus Andronicus, and we didn't have a director, and there were several directors mentioned. And I was very keen, as he was, that we get someone new, and someone who had a whole fresh and new approach. And I said, there's this girl, called, and I couldn't remember her name. I said, I read about her in she runs a theatre called, and I couldn't remember what the theatre was called. But I remember that she'd done something with ladders. I remember that, and it was about King Lear, and that she'd done this production of King Lear. And of course, Terry knew who she was. She said, Deborah Warner. I said, yeah, that's her. I said, well, what about her? He said, yeah, and it so happened, I think that afternoon she was about to go off to Sweden. It was a Tuesday, I remember. And I think that would have been it if we hadn't caught her in time. And I couldn't remember, Terry remembered the name. We would have been stuck. But no, she's quite extraordinary, really.
It must be quite tricky for an actor of your generation and experience to find yourself. Well, I was trying to find a subtle way of putting it. A mature actor, an established actor, to suddenly find yourself working with a girl in her mid-20s.
Yes, but Deborah doesn't behave like someone in her mid-20s. I mean, she does have the kind of mark of a 95-year-old. No, not really. I mean, she's ageless, Deborah. She could be any age, and she has that kind of. She's incredibly cool. I mean, sometimes too cool, I think, for her own good. I think she could be a bit more uncool, but she's very sort of.
You're the key, darling.
Carol, we're doing an interview here, darling, which you told me about downstairs. No, sorry, that's the stage manager. She's the company manager. Anyway, what were you saying? Let me start again.
Yes, the relationship that you strike up with a director of such tender years.
Oh yeah, I mean, as I say, she's ageless, Deborah. I mean, she really comes across as a sort of. I don't think there's any mark of age about her. It would be very difficult to realize she was 25. She could be anything between 25 and 55 or 65. That sounds very unflattering, but it's just that she has that quality. And as I say, she's a very cool lady, and sometimes too cool for her own good, but she is amazing. She's very...
What is the gift that she has, particularly obviously in the rehearsal stage, putting in production together, which sets her apart?
Well, her gift is an infuriating one because she doesn't seem to do anything, and yet she does everything. I mean, she seems to... it would be very hard to really describe. She's not like Peter Brook, who has an extraordinary sort of intellectual, spiritual perception of his work. She doesn't. She's like a receiver of information, and she works by just kind of receiving everything and filtering out what she doesn't want, almost invisibly. You can't see her doing it. It would be very difficult to describe how one works with Deborah. She very much relies on the actors in many ways, but then she sort of filters out what she doesn't want the actors to do, and she has a way of doing it. She's incredibly politically deft in her operation, and she's very tough in not a very obvious way. She's very sort of tough inside, and it's very hard. I mean, but the extraordinary thing is that the work process is a great work process. And it's an egalitarian one because she uses as I say, she uses all the influences of all the actors to be put in, so that you're working. What she did with me was I was doing things that for years people have tried not to make me do as an actor, because there is a lot of what goes on in England particularly is a lot of tight sphincter directing, where everything's done to a kind of modicum of taste and sensibility, which sometimes is very hard going. And I've grown up with that because I think when I started I was very rough. And Deborah, in a way, has got me back to that sense of immediacy and pushing you further into those directions. Again, invisibly doing it. I mean, there's one point in rehearsal I said, well, that's too much. And she said, no, it's fine. Just do it. Whereas if I'd been working with some other directors who I shan't mention, they would be going, oh, no, you can't do that. No, you mustn't. They would kind of, and they sort of direct like that, where everything gets sucked in. And the energy is so kind of careful and controlled. And in that way, I suppose she's more European. Except if you met Deborah, she's typically English. She couldn't be anything else. Yet her results are not like that. There's a kind of paradox there.
It's been, in a way, quite a hard time, I think, for established actors in the British theatre, because there's been a period of director dominance, of different kind of director theatre. Does she represent a sort of a new wave of directors' relationship with actors, do you think?
I think very much so. I mean, I think of Deborah as a gardener. I think she's really more like a gardener than a director. She takes all the plants and gets the flower beds and arranges it and really kind of makes it grow. I mean, she's very, very organic. I don't really hold with the notion of I'm sort of caught in middle ground between these two polarities of directors have been screwing us up for a long time, we should get rid of them, and the director's theatre. I think Deborah certainly is, to my mind, is the proper balance between these two extremes, because you do need a director, and you do need a vision, and you do need a skill which has a sense of the other responsibilities of the play. Now, my view is that actors should have this responsibility anyway, but they don't always do so, tragically. And I think that's partly because historically they've abdicated that responsibility, really since the war, and it's been taken away from them in very subtle ways. Mind you, I doubt if they ever really had it in the 30s, because the boulevard actors were much more vainglorious. I think actors subsequently they're a much kind of rawer breed. But Deborah represents the real way of harnessing that ability, and at the same time very much a view, creating the view of the play.
Announcement coming there now? Okay, just come back to that beginning of that sentence, then Deborah has a view of it.
What?
Still running?
Okay.
Yeah.
What Deborah has is she has a real overall view of what you're doing, which comes from the event itself. It's not something she puts on top of it. It's something which grows through the period of rehearsal and through how that production shapes up. She hasn't got any preconceptions. And where she's very strong in that way, and where she's very liberated in that way, she works with a very good bunch of designers, a lot of good young female designers, Isabella Bywater on this, and I think she's very infuriating to a lot of designers because she will not make certain decisions, and quite rightly so. And I think that's how her operation works, because her design is very fluid, and yet at the same time it's concrete. It's very strong. Again, it's a paradox, but she has an unerring instinct for that, an unerring instinct for bringing those two things together.
When you were rehearsing Titus, presumably in the normal sort of 5 or 6 week period, and she didn't come with a concrete perception from the start, did you notice a time when she got herself around this immensely difficult play, which generally is a graveyard for directors?
Yes, I think it was really around about the time when she really invented when the whole idea of the end of the play, the whole business of the preparing of the meal, and the way she took all those ideas and then developed this sort of chorus idea. And I suddenly saw that was the mark of her power as a director, her sense of choreography and her sense of image there, and starkness, spareness. Because she is very much in the tradition, in the English tradition of spareness, but she's not spare in any ungiving way. She's spare to the line, to the knuckle, so that you can actually allow things to come through. And I think that was very, I mean, I particularly noticed it when we were doing the scene in the cook scene, you know, and when she was working on that, because a lot of ideas flying around, I mean, a lot of ideas, and the idea about the Kick Work song, which was a song that they used for the Kick Theatre Company, which was the Hi Ho, which people have kind of, it's the one, as it were, I can never remember the word, it's the one thing that's out of the ordinary in the production. And she went with that, absolutely, right to the wall with it, but in a way that she made it so much part of the meter of the play, really. And I think that's her ability. I think her ability is doing that. Sometimes, if anything, sometimes she's textually not as strong as she might be. Sometimes she's not as textually accurate as she might be, actually what is actually happening. That's where sometimes she may allow the actors to take it off into areas of where actors are maybe being too logical with the text or too fanciful with the text, and she's maybe not good at corralling that a bit. That's maybe her only fault.
It's interesting, isn't it, that she's making her name with period classics and in fact with difficult ones for the most part. This seems a strange way young directors would normally, you'd expect to shine with contemporary work.
I think that Deborah, I mean, without putting words into her mouth, I think she finds it very difficult to deal with contemporary work. And I mean, I know there was a contemporary play that she was asked to do last year, and she really found it very difficult to connect with, because essentially she is poetic. I mean, underneath that exterior, she is enormously poetic, and that's the thing that I recognize in her. Really, there's quite a strong poetic sense in her, and that's why she's taken to these kind of archetypal plays. And also, she's given the difficult ones. I mean, the thing that made me laugh is that when we did Titus and we made a success of it, then one of the directors of the RSC, who was in charge of the company, suggested that we might do Henry VIII, because we had a success with difficult Shakespearean plays. And I suddenly saw that they were lining us up as a team that would do all the difficult Shakespeares and kind of revamp them, which to a certain extent is not what I'm interested in, certainly it's not what Deborah's interested in. It was a nice idea, but I think it's a kind of foolish idea. Though I think one of the plays we would like to tackle will be Timon of Athens, which is a play, again, that's not being explored. And that was the interesting thing about doing Titus. I think in all honesty, I think Deborah was really honest. I don't think that she would have done Titus if it was her choice. I think it was one of those ways of getting people together. And I think Terry has to be given the credit for that. And particularly that whole season, the season that's just passed, which I think is one of the, I mean, I'm biased because I was involved in it, was the best seasons the RSC had. And it's because Terry did really get the mixture of people right. And I think that was, you know, it was a good marriage.
Where do you see Deborah's future, given your feeling about her talent? Where should it lie? Within the big companies, running her own company, taking on a directorship of a large company, or where?
This is very hard, because it's very hard because really you're talking about the future of English theatre. And I think we're in a slightly doldrum situation. I think companies are the answer. I mean, that's the thing that I've come to after 25 years of doing this game. I don't think there's any way that you can get around. The best work is done within an ensemble situation. I think the theatre has been too influenced by kind of television type casting, television type, attitudes. I mean, the National is too bound with not being companies but one-offs. But at the same time, I think a company has to have the vision of a director or a collective group like the Royal Exchange have or the Glasgow Citizens have. And I do think that that's where Deborah really ideally fits in. I mean, she is up for a theatre like this theatre, the Booth. I mean, that would be ideal for Deborah, I think, that Peter Brook situation. But I think it would be great in England, not necessarily in Europe. And I think England should wake up to the fact that that's where the best theatre lies, actually.
But that means backing and funding people of her sort of talent.
And it needs funding and it needs money, But there is a whole new generation of people who really are enormously talented. I mean, we went through a period in the 70s which wasn't particularly good. But suddenly there's this whole kind of generation of directors and actors coming forward. And in a way, they've got to be given the backing and the support to take the theatre in a new direction. Or else we will end up in a sort of Comédie Française situation where the theatres become antiques. Or the Moscow Arts, where the theatre has become an antique. I've been working in Moscow, and it's very interesting what's happening there. I mean, this is slightly off the point of the programme, but it's an allegory because there are all these young actors and young directors who don't want to work in the Moscow Arts Theatre. And the interesting thing about a socialist state is they can afford not to, because they can go off and start new theatre ventures, which is the advantage of socialism, if you like. And it's very hard in England, but it's there, the blood is there, and also, places like Glasgow, which I think is probably the coming city of all the cities. I mean, it'd be interesting to see Deborah run a situation in Glasgow, which was a kind of new theatre situation. And I'd go and work for her. I think really what we need in it, and it's a situation I'd like to put myself into, because I think it's something I could do quite well, is a Diaghilev situation. It's to actually get somebody who's going to run the show.
That's right.
And say, I mean, the problem at the moment is that the IC is the self-perpetuating oligarchy.
Which is actually, has been a negative factor. We weren't as aware of it, but I think even when travel was still there, it was already